To what extent then does Pakistan's sort of long-standing policy of use or accommodation of these sorts of militant groups mean? Does it still really hold now? Or was this events in the latter part of this year mean a sort of turning point, so to speak?
The Pakistani government, the state position is that groups that it used to sponsor, like Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, these mainly anti-India groups, that they don't have a presence in Pakistan. They're based in Afghanistan and so on. That position could certainly be contested, but I do think there's reason to believe that in recent years Pakistan has sought to distance itself a bit from those groups that it used to sponsor. Though of course, in India the view is very different, right? I mean, the terrorist attack that triggered the May conflict was an attack that India linked Pakistan to, even though it never provided any evidence to prove that, at least not in the public domain.
This is The Global Gambit.
How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the channel where, well, have you been seeing in the news that there is some conflicts, some border clashes? The once rather forgotten about state of Afghanistan is now striking with the Pakistani government. There's a lot of tension. And building on that, Pakistan has also signed a strategic partnership with Saudi Arabia last month. And with that in mind, I thought, well, there's quite a lot of appetite for some deeper conversation, some deeper analysis. And so that's what we're going to do with this two-parter conversation, because my guest today is Michael Kugelman, the American foreign policy author and expert specializing in South Asia. He's a writer of Foreign Policy Magazine's weekly South Asia brief. Michael, we've had you on a couple of times before, I think, and I'm delighted to have you back. In the first part of this, I really wanted to understand from you what is happening on the borders between Pakistan and Afghanistan. Have we largely seen the height of tensions, or is this something that could simmer over again?
Yeah, so it's great to be back with you. Thanks for having me. So, I mean, there is a ceasefire that was concluded over the weekend that, in principle, ends what has been the worst violence between Afghanistan and Pakistan since the Taliban came back to power in 2021. We're talking about dozens killed. Afghanistan has alleged that civilians, including several Afghan cricket players, were killed in Pakistani airstrikes in recent days. So we're talking about really serious violence. So the ceasefire is very good news. And my understanding is that the two sides have pledged to continue talking, to talk about how they'll be able to implement mechanisms to ensure that the ceasefire remains in place for an extended period. And also worth noting, I mean, I think this has been mentioned a lot, but it is worth noting that there were two external mediators, Qatar and Turkey, that mediated these talks, which were held in Doha. So the good news is that there's a ceasefire, which has ended the violence for now. But I would argue that it's an extremely fraught situation. I mean, the Afghanistan-Pakistan border has always been fraught since the moment that Pakistan became an independent state in 1947, and we can get into this. The proximate reason for the violence and the tensions in recent weeks has been essentially terrorism. The fact that there are terrorists based in Afghanistan that have been carrying out attacks in Pakistan at an increasing rate for several years. And the Taliban has been unwilling to do anything about that. And this has gotten Pakistan increasingly frustrated. And so what we saw, what triggered the most recent crisis was Pakistan carrying out especially intense strikes in Afghanistan. Not the first time that Pakistan has carried out counterterrorism operations in Afghanistan, but nothing like what we hadn't seen until this point, the level. There were strikes in several different provinces, including in Kabul, which is unprecedented, I believe. And the Taliban then retaliated by attacking Pakistani border posts, and that led to more deaths. And then there was a tit for tat. Pakistan carried out additional strikes in Afghanistan. There were more Taliban retaliation. So that's what happened. There is an irony that I'll note here that, we're talking about Afghanistan-based terrorists carrying out attacks in Pakistan. As you well know, during the war years in Afghanistan, it was the opposite. You had terrorists in Pakistan that were carrying out attacks in Afghanistan, and back then it was the Afghan government that was unhappy that Pakistan was not doing enough to curb those attacks. But in both cases here, you have sponsorship, right? Pakistan was sponsoring militants in Pakistan that were carrying out attacks in Afghanistan, and now Afghanistan, the Taliban, is essentially sponsoring anti-Pakistan militants carrying out attacks in Pakistan. So just briefly to get to the final part of your question, have we seen the worst of the violence behind us? I hope so, but I'm not optimistic. The main reason I say that is that the Taliban has a very close relationship with the most potent anti-Pakistan terror group based in Afghanistan, that being Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, Pakistani Taliban, or TTP. The Taliban has no intention of curbing this group, quite frankly, despite what it might have said after the ceasefire talks were concluded. It's had a very deep relationship with the TTP. TTP leaders have fought with the Afghan Taliban in Afghanistan. And one thing we've seen over history is that the Taliban do not turn on their closest allies. And we can think of the Al-Qaeda example, right? When the Taliban was under pressure to end its ties with Al-Qaeda, when it was threatened with a U.S. military invasion, it didn't agree to do that. So that's it. And, turning things over to you, the thing I'll say is we're talking about terrorism, cross-border violence, and all that as the source of the tensions in the relationship. But let's not forget that the border itself is disputed, because Afghanistan has never accepted, no Afghan government has ever accepted the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, whereas Pakistan has.
Well, that's a very good point, of which I had rather forgotten, actually. So, a lot there to unpick in the initial response, Michael. I think what I am curious is a little bit more about this TTP element, because from my understanding, there's been a lot of obscurity. How feasible is cross-border action for Pakistan, for example? Like, could you unpack a little bit more about the operations by this militant group and sort of, I want to get into a little bit more the strategic dynamics of other countries and how they are legitimizing the Taliban increasingly versus the rather pariah status that Pakistan has had in recent years. So, what about the TTP element in this?
Yeah, so the TTP is right at the middle of this because, as I said, it's the most potent terrorist group operating in Pakistan. It has a presence in Pakistan, but it does have bases in Afghanistan. So the TTP is not new. It's been around for a while. It was formally established in around 2007, as I recall, and it was formed as a reaction to Pakistan's support for U.S. efforts in Afghanistan back then, and more broadly, the alliance between the then Pakistani leadership of Pervez Musharraf with the George W. Bush administration. And back then, the TTP was even more potent than it is now. Back then, it was targeting essentially anything in its path. Today, it only targets security forces, but back then it was going after civilians. So you had a period between 2007 2014 where it was just a really bad scene. So Pakistan cracked down on the group with a counterterrorism offensive in North Waziristan 2014, which did degrade the group, and though it significantly, it also displaced a lot of its fighters and leaders into Afghanistan. It's quiet for a few years. It resurfaced, I'd say around 2018, when it had a new leader that was able to bring back a number of splinter groups that have broken off from TTP. That really put it in a better place. But then 2021 was key when the Taliban returned to power in Afghanistan. That really provided the TTP with the formal spaces and sanctuaries that really helped it retool. It was able to get access, I'm sure, to the advanced weaponry that the collapsing Afghan security forces squandered as they were collapsing. And they've been, pulling off increasing numbers of attacks since then. As I said, they mainly target Pakistani security forces, but they've also targeted Chinese investment projects. They certainly cannot, one cannot trust them when they say that they only target the elements of the Pakistani state, but that is essentially what they've been doing. And as I see it, this is the critical group here. And in the past, Pakistan has tried to hold talks with the TTP to end the violence and the terror, which did not work. Pakistan has tried to pressure the Taliban to curb the TTP by sending back large numbers of Afghan refugees to Afghanistan. And there also have been limited counterterrorism strikes that Pakistan has carried out in Afghanistan against TTP. But that didn't help either. And so today, the group is in a very good place. It's got a presence in Pakistan. It's got a base in Afghanistan. And it's really quite a conundrum for the Pakistani state.
Well, on that point, so the community here is pretty international. We have a large proportion of people who maybe hail from Pakistan or part of the diaspora, but there's plenty of people who don't know the intricacies of this. And obviously, in the time that I've covered or followed the events in Pakistan, it's a country that's been in a very difficult, shall we say, set of political crises. And I was wondering if you could help explain to listeners and viewers the relationship of that to events now, because it seems to me that the inability for the country internally to get at least stable, politically speaking, that this leads to insecurity and instability. Is that a bit of a crude outline? What would you say about it?
Well, I mean, it's very complicated. I mean, Pakistan has been chronically politically unstable for many years, and one reason for that is the immense clout of the military, which is where you have to start when you talk about Pakistani politics. This is a country that has had numerous periods of extended military rule, and even when there is not formal military rule, such as now, the military exerts significant amounts of clout. And that sometimes works in the sense that, this sense of brutally enforcing stability, so to speak, but it also causes problems for civil military relations where civilian leaders grow unhappy about having to defer and cede so much policy space to the military. And, there have been many political crises in Pakistan where you have civil military clashes. And, I think one of the loudest and most famous ones in recent years was when Imran Khan was prime minister. In Pakistan, it's very difficult to become prime minister or hold a senior post if you're a civilian if you don't have the backing of the military. And Khan had that, but he just didn't like. There were a number of things he didn't like, and he disagreed with the army on a number of things. And then basically they were at loggerheads, and the army essentially sponsored a parliamentary no confidence vote that resulted in Khan being sent packing. So this is one problem where you have this very strong military, and you also have consequences that include civil military tensions. And I would also argue that a number of other factors that are certainly not unique to Pakistan have contributed to instability in Pakistan. Whether you're talking about lack of capacity, corruption issues, severe levels of polarization between different political parties, and so on. The broader instability factor, including the terrorism issue, I think that's separate to a large degree. That comes down to other policies that have been implemented in the past in Pakistan, such as a very well-known policy of Pakistan's security establishment sponsoring a number of terrorist groups to pursue Pakistani goals outside of Pakistan. Pakistan has sponsored terrorists that carry out attacks in Afghanistan and in India, whereas they try to crack down against those that target Pakistan itself. When you do something like that, you play with fire. It's very complex. You have terrorists that might one day want to carry out attacks outside of Pakistan, but then they might want to turn their attention to Pakistan. And so this has really created a situation where you've always had this, or not always, but for much of the last few decades, radicalization risks are very real in Pakistan, and you have a lot of bad guys that are, keen to do things that that are not good, so to speak. So, to put it very simply, Pakistan has been dealing with separate challenges, and there's the economic side as well. I mean, there's been chronic economic struggles because of an unwillingness to pass certain levels of reforms, and because of vested interests that are not inclined to allow for tax reforms that would broaden the tax base and ensure more revenue coming to the government. So it's very complicated for sure. It's like concurrent crises and challenges that tend to play out episodically and oftentimes come together.
Yes, no, I think, you can break them down: economic, political, even the environmental disasters that the country has suffered in the past couple of years. But on the flip side, obviously, while Pakistan has been seen by some, or maybe at least in the Western world, a pariah, I'm sure some people in the comments will disagree with that, but that's the term that, some people have used. On the flip side, there seems to be a growing normalization, legitimization of the Taliban, right? At this rate, and sort of mainly because I think that people want to just sort of try to help the Afghan people from a humanitarian standpoint, and if that means just accepting the ruling government or whatever leading entity that is the Taliban, that's the better decision. How much is that a factor in these latest clashes, or in the broader sort of geopolitical context, or you don't think it has as much?
Yeah, it's a good question. First, just briefly to your point about Pakistan as a pariah, I don't think it's a pariah, and I don't think it's ever been viewed as one. I mean, certainly its global brand hasn't been the best, especially I think the low water mark was when bin Laden was found, living very close to the main Pakistani military academy. But, Pakistan, despite what India would like to try to do and think, Pakistan has never really been isolated, and there's significant levels of engagement, from the West and certainly in the region, and of course the Muslim world. But that's, I guess, a story for another day. So to your question about the Taliban, yes, of course, only one country has formally recognized the Taliban regime, that being Russia. But I would argue that this second iteration of the Taliban, separating it from the Taliban that controlled much of Afghanistan in the late 90s to 2001, it's not isolated. It's not an international pariah. It's been engaging quite closely with many countries around the world, including U.S. officials. And we even had 2 times this year a senior U.S. official travel to Kabul and meet with Taliban officials there to discuss the release of U.S. citizens that were being held captive. That's pretty legitimizing, right? I mean, if you have a senior U.S. official on Afghan soil when it's controlled by the Taliban, that's significant. I think this gets to your point that I think the world has essentially accepted that the Taliban is here to stay, that they don't really face any type of threats to their rule or their survival. You have Islamic State Khorasan, which is a rival of the Taliban, but it's a terror group. It's not in a position to overthrow the Taliban. And unlike in the 90s, when you had this ongoing civil war and you had a number of armed anti-Taliban groups, those groups are really weak now, quite frankly. So I think that much of the world has basically accepted the Taliban's here to stay for pragmatic reasons. It pays to engage, even if on official, informal levels, with the Taliban. And India, I think, is a really useful case study in that regard. India, of course, had essentially a hostile relationship with the Taliban for many years. It blamed the Taliban for attacking the Indian embassy in Kabul. And of course, the Taliban, with its long-standing alliance with Pakistan, India saw that as a problem. But the Taliban foreign minister just spent a week in India recently, and they're engaging quite closely. India is going to be reopening its embassy in Kabul. I think that'll help India track the terrorism concerns that it's worried about in Afghanistan. But basically, the world is prepared to engage, and I think that many capitals think that they could pursue their interests in Taliban-led Afghanistan simply by engaging informally with the Taliban and not formally recognizing it. We're even starting to see, like the UN, for example, taking a different position. The UN, of course, has an annual climate summit. And the last UN climate summit earlier this year, Taliban reps were allowed to attend that to represent Afghanistan for the first time. And I think that's pretty significant as well. So and bringing this to the current conflict, the fact that the Taliban is not viewed as a pariah, I think made it, it certainly did not present complications when it came to external mediation, right? As I noted before, both Turkey and Qatar mediated these talks between the Taliban and Pakistan, and I think that's pretty significant. They were comfortable mediating, and a deal that would be signed involving the Taliban. Of course, as you know, Qatar for many years has been home to the Taliban political office, so there's a bit of a special relationship there. I think that the Taliban wants legitimacy. It wants to get formal recognition, which it hasn't gotten, but it's gotten plenty of legitimacy, which is one step short of recognition, and perfectly fine with how things have worked out.
So a bit more about the ceasefire, because from my understanding, it was temporary, 48 hours initially. Obviously, it will be substantiated on. What can you tell us a bit more about the Qatari Turkish involvement there? The Qatari one you've mentioned a bit, but Turkey's quite interesting. It strikes me that Turkey's really trying to get more of a solid foundation across broader parts of the entire Muslim or Islamic world, as we've seen them, very active in Gaza or negotiations of that. So a bit more about that, I would be very interested in.
Yeah, well, Turkey is clearly trying to showcase its clout and its influence as a regional power in the Middle East and perhaps beyond. But what's important in this context is that Turkey actually has a very close relationship with Pakistan. We talk a lot about Pakistan's alliance with China and Saudi Arabia and so on. It's quietly built up a very strong rapport with Turkey. During the recent India-Pakistan conflict in May, Pakistan actually used Turkish weaponry. It used Turkish drones for the first time, which is pretty significant. So I think that Turkey's involvement as a mediator was especially significant given its close relationship with Pakistan. Qatar, of course, has very good relations with both Pakistan and the Taliban, especially because it had hosted the Taliban political office. But I think that Turkey is looking to showcase its clout and wants to be seen as a player like the Arab Gulf states, like China, like others, countries that are, powerful in their own right, but also have the capacity and the willingness to mediate, international challenges, especially those fairly close to home, and especially one that impacts a close partner like Pakistan.
To what extent then does Pakistan's sort of long-standing policy of use or accommodation of these sorts of militant groups mean? Does it still really hold now, or was this events in the latter part of this year mean a sort of turning point, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, it's very fuzzy as to what's actually going on now with Pakistan's relationship with these various groups. I mean, the official the Pakistani government, the state position is that groups that it used to sponsor, like Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, these mainly anti-India groups, that they don't have a presence in Pakistan. They're based in Afghanistan and so on. That position could certainly be contested. But I do think there's reason to believe that in recent years, Pakistan has sought to distance itself a bit from those groups that it used to sponsor. Though, of course, in India, the view is very different, right? I mean, the terrorist attack that triggered the May conflict was an attack that India linked Pakistan to, even though it never provided any evidence to prove that, at least not in the public domain. But look, Pakistan's main concern when it comes to terrorism these days is the group or the groups that are targeting Pakistan relentlessly. And we've talked about the TTP, but it's other groups too, like these ethnic separatists, particularly the Baluch separatists, like the Baluchistan Liberation Army, which has become much more potent over the last few years than it had been in previous years. Earlier this year, it actually pulled something off that's extremely unusual in any context. It hijacked an entire passenger train, which is remarkable for a militant group to do that. Anyway, this is Pakistan's main concern, and I think that it wants to. Well, it feels a strong need to figure out what to do about these groups because it's been unable to put an end to them, and it has carried out scorched earth counterterrorism operations in Baluchistan many times over the decades to expunge this threat, but invariably that just makes the problem worse because it radicalizes local communities and it brings more recruits to the very groups that Pakistan is trying to weaken. So I think that's really Pakistan's main concern now is trying to figure out how to rein in these anti-state groups.
Fair. And I guess the last question I have for you in this first half, so people are interested, be sure to stick around for the second half and by subscribing, but is looking ahead, if Pakistan continues to feel that its border is too, I don't know, porous or sort of open, what options does it have? Escalation, diplomacy, more external sort of interference, and specifically on that, like maybe a two-pronged part to this is the role of India here, because obviously Pakistan did have significant clashes with India in May, and so it's the second large cross-border, I don't know, engagement that the countries had. So, any forward-looking thoughts there on my rather random assortment of words and thoughts?
Yeah, no, it makes good sense. I mean, Pakistan is stuck. I think that it hopes that the ceasefire with the Taliban will prompt the Taliban to finally curb TTP. And I think what Pakistan is banking on is that there's now an internationally mediated agreement between the Taliban and Pakistan, and it's also banking on the fact that the Taliban have now seen Pakistan use significant levels of firepower in Afghanistan to go after TTP. I think Pakistan knows that the Taliban in Afghanistan might talk tough and retaliate when those types of things happen, but the Taliban is too weak to get into a head-on-head conventional war with the Pakistani military, which is so much more powerful. And yes, we talk about Afghanistan as a graveyard of empires and all that, but Pakistan knows the terrain. It's not a foreign power. It's quite capable of operating along the border and inflicting a lot of damage on the Taliban. Anyway, so I think Pakistan is hoping that combination of factors will prompt the Taliban to finally curb the TTP, but I don't think that's going to happen for the reasons I mentioned before, but also this. The Taliban fears, I'm quite confident, that if it were actually to try to expel TTP from Afghanistan, if it were to try to use force on them, that could risk provoking an internal rebellion within the Taliban because of how well regarded the TTP is by the Taliban. And you could have Taliban foot soldiers, perhaps even Taliban leaders, that turn on the Taliban leadership, or they could abandon the Taliban and join Islamic State. So there's a very practical reason, an institutional reason for the Taliban to hold off on going after TTP. So basically, what can Pakistan do? I think, quite frankly, that, and this doesn't bode well for border stability. I think that if the ceasefire doesn't hold and the attacks start again, and there have already been a few terrorist attacks in Pakistan over the last few days since the ceasefire, Pakistan might go right back to carrying out strikes again in Afghanistan, and it could intensify them, which, again, is not a good thing for stability. I just don't see at this point any other option. I mean, one could talk about trying to work with the Taliban on some type of border security agreement where they pledge to ensure that you don't have militants going back and forth across the border, but that requires trust that these two, quite frankly, at this time, don't have. And there's also the border issue itself, that the Taliban do not recognize the border. They don't recognize the Duran line. So the idea of the Taliban working with Pakistan on the security of a border that they don't recognize, that's a problem too.
It is quite a problem. But thank you, Michael, for watching. Thanks for watching part 1. See you in part 2. If Saudi Arabia is not going to do anything when India's, striking Pakistan, what's the point of this? Why does it matter then?
This is a lot more about considerations in the Middle East than it is about South Asia or India. I really think it comes down to Saudi concerns about what Israel has done in recent weeks, particularly its strikes in Qatar, and looking to essentially diversify its security partners to ensure that it has the protection or the support that it needs in a very troubled region, to put it mildly. And there's also the nuclear factor, and this gets into some somewhat speculative grounds. I don't want to say too much about this, but there's been some discussion that Pakistan has essentially been willing to extend its nuclear deterrent capacity, or not extended, but the fact that Pakistan has nuclear weapons is relevant for this deal, in the sense that Pakistan is joining this alliance, or this defense pact with Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan not only has a very strong, able military, but it also has nuclear weapons.